Hello and welcome to the Journal. I'm Steve Kendall. November 8th general election is less than 2 months away, and early in-person voting begins in early October. All of Ohio's statewide offices are on the ballot. We're joined by the host of the State of Ohio. Karen Kasler has been a guest on the show multiple times. She's been in the process of interviewing some of the statewide candidates. There are more to come between now and November. Karen, I want to thank you again for being with us. In watching the show, you've interviewed so far treasurer candidates, auditor candidates, obviously Attorney General, Secretary of State. I assume you're going to get the gubernatorial candidates on. What have been just some kind of the themes that both sides are trying to play right now? Because obviously they're trying to use that as an effort to put forward their program, why you should vote for me when they're talking with you.
Well, and the reason, first of all, thanks for inviting me to be back on the show. The reason that I'm doing this series, which we're calling Conversations with the Candidates, I do this every 4 years. These are the 5 statewide executive offices, like you just mentioned: governor, secretary of state, treasurer, auditor, and attorney general. And some of these offices and the races kind of fly under the radar and are not given as much attention as, like, in this particular election season. You've got the race for governor, you've got the U.S. Senate race, and some other races that are just as important, but still, these are important offices. And so we'll want to spend some time with the folks who are running to try to understand why they're running and what their big issues are. I talked to the candidates for treasurer earlier, and then this past weekend was candidates for auditor. Coming up is attorney general, then secretary of state, and then the individual candidates for governor. I hope to sit down with them individually for a full show. And some of the issues that I'm hearing a lot about, I think Democrats want to talk about corruption in state government, and they want to talk about reproductive rights, especially after the Dobbs decision that overturned the right to abortion at the federal level. And those issues of corruption in state government, they tie that to the House Bill 6 sweeping energy law. It was the nuclear power plant bailout that still has subsidies going to 2 coal-fired power plants. There's still a lot of questions about who knew what when, and former Speaker Larry Householder set for trial in January on that, though he has pleaded not guilty. There's that, and then of course the reproductive rights issue, which, I mean, it's interesting to talk to some of these candidates and find that you don't even have to ask them about it. They want to talk about it, even though it's hard to maybe connect the treasurer's office to the issue of abortion. But they say that's what they're hearing from people. On the Republican side, I'm hearing a lot more about inflation and the economy and concerns about how costs are affecting real people, and a lot less about some of these other issues, and specifically on the culture of corruption issue. The 2 candidates I've talked to about this have said this is an issue that really belongs in the federal government's hands, in the FBI's hands, the federal prosecutor's hands. And so we at the state level are not really involved. Democrats say that they could be doing more on that.
Right, and I know when you were talking about that particular issue and reproductive rights, you did get some personal comments from some of the candidates about, well, my office doesn't really deal with that, but of course here are my feelings on it. So, and especially Democrats, obviously, they see that as a wedge issue. Republicans are kind of, well, I really don't want to go there if I don't have to. But I noticed that at least one of the candidates mentioned that, well, here's my personal feelings. My office doesn't really deal with that, but everybody knows this is how I feel. So it's a nuanced game being played, especially on the Republican side with candidates on some of those issues.
Yeah, and also it's not necessarily a winning issue for Democrats, at least it hasn't been in the past. Democrats have tried to run on the culture of corruption issue before, specifically with the electronic classroom of tomorrow, the ECOT scandal, and all the money. In fact, the state auditor says ECOT still owes Ohio $117 million for kids that it was paid to educate who didn't get an education. It didn't exist, right? But that's an issue that really hasn't tracked with voters. And recent polls, there was a Suffolk poll out last week that only 4% of people identified corruption as their #1 issue. And so now I don't know if maybe corruption is their second most important issue. The poll didn't really look into that. But it suggests that this is not something that people are really seizing on as an issue of importance, like they have seized on the economy, like they've seized on reproductive rights and abortion.
Yeah, and you'd like to think that it isn't just a case of, well, we know there's corruption, so they're not concerned about it because it just goes on. I mean, you hope that we're not quite that cynical as voters and citizens in Ohio. It's like, well, yeah, there's corruption. Tell me something I don't already know about. You hope that's not the case. I think it's interesting, as you mentioned too, that you're trying to make sure that people meet these candidates, especially the ones that are statewide, but yet aren't names necessarily. The Secretary of State gets his name in because there's election discussions going on all the time. Not so much with the auditor, the treasurer, those kind of offices. And in fact, probably in some cases, people couldn't name the state auditor who's currently there, let alone the person who might be running against him. So it is an effort to at least let people say, oh, I can put a name, a face to the name, or at least find out who that is that's running for auditor, that sort of thing.
And one thing that I am asking all the Republican incumbents, because all 5 of those offices have Republican incumbents and they are all in ballot sign, and they've all been endorsed by former President Trump. And I'm asking them on the record, since Trump has continued to claim without evidence this false idea that he won the 2020 election, I'm asking each one of them to say, for the record, if they affirm the results of the 2020 election. And so far, the Republicans I've talked to have said yes, but they're concerned about certain things in the voting system. They say Ohio does it right. Trump won Ohio by about 475,000 votes, but that they're concerned about what's happening in other states. So I think it's important to get those candidates on the record, since they are appearing with Trump. They are touting his endorsement as he is talking about this big lie that he won the election in 2020 when he didn't. I think it's important for all of us to understand where they stand on that.
Yeah, and one of the things, and especially for the Secretary of State, who really is in charge, one of his responsibilities is state elections at every level, basically, puts him in a difficult spot, because he can't be saying, well, we're not sure about our election system in Ohio, when he's the chief elections officer. And Ohio does have, you hear people say there should be picture IDs. Well, Ohio doesn't necessarily have there are 8 different ways you can identify yourself when you go in to vote, and not all of them require a photo, and yet Ohio's elections seem to run, at least on the surface, as everybody believes, have run well, have not shown huge amounts of fraud and massive numbers of votes that were cast illegally or not cast or cast incorrectly. So it's interesting that we have this more open sort of identification system. Our system runs fine, yet we're concerned about other states, which is just sort of a kind of a conundrum there, but it is what it is.
And I would argue that it's not just on the system or on the surface that it appears to go well. I mean, there are audits in every single county. There are bipartisan boards of elections in every single county. And while there are small instances of problems, and they are referred to prosecutors and others, and quite often they are not prosecuted because in some cases they're mistakes. They're genuinely people who didn't understand that they were not qualified to vote. There really isn't a fraud problem in Ohio. There isn't a fraud problem in Ohio. I mean, the last report I've seen is, some 20, I think around 20 people who were referred for prosecution out of 5.9 million people who cast ballots, a record number of people casting ballots in 2020. And yet we have these claims, these unfounded claims of voter fraud. And also there's something that's been happening in boards of elections around Ohio and in a couple of other states, where you have election deniers who are fueling the effort to try to get public records information from boards of elections. They have asked boards of elections in all 88 counties, small numbers of requests, but huge amounts of information they want. They want to see all the ballots. They want to see all of the voting machine tapes, which are 70 or 80 feet long. They want to see all of the voter ID envelopes from absentee voting. And boards of elections now are in a position where they don't know how to handle these requests. And it's coming up against the 2022 election that they're now currently trying to put together. When I talked to Secretary of State Frank LaRose, he said he's going to advise the boards that they can wait to fulfill those public records requests. They can do them. They can do them after the 2020 election, because early voting starts October 12th. We're already in the 2022 midterm.
Yeah. Well, we come back, let's talk a little bit more about that, because obviously we're still, as you said, we're still in some cases discussing 2020 with 2022 just over the horizon. So back in just a moment with Karen Kasler, a host of the State of Ohio, here on The Journal. Thanks for staying with us on The Journal. Our guest is Karen Kasler, the host of the State of Ohio, which you can see every Sunday at 12 noon here on WBGU-PBS. When we left the last segment, Karen, we were talking about the fact that the Secretary of State has already said to boards of election who are being inundated with public records requests about the 2020 election that he will say, okay, look, wait until after we clear 2022, then go back and work on those public record requests, because obviously they have their hands full between now and November 8th preparing and getting the 2022 election in place. And what you surely don't want to have happen there is have some sort of implication that, well, because we were so busy doing 2020's recount or rehashing, we messed up 2022. So it puts everybody in a difficult position, but it's good to see the Secretary of State is saying, look, let's worry about 2020 after 2022. Let's get through the main game here, the main program, and then we'll go back and discuss 2020 again to whatever degree we have to.
Well, and boards of elections, as we were discussing earlier, are bipartisan. There's a real attempt to get the vote as accurate as possible. And again, we are in the midst of the 2022 midterms with overseas and military ballots going out this week. And so early voting starts October 12th. There's a lot of preparation that needs to take place, and boards of elections are still coming off the August primary that was just for state House and Senate districts, as well as state central committees. And while that turnout of that for that election was very, very low, they still had to prepare for that. They still had to work that election. This has been a very busy year. And to get these requests, and they're identical other than different names at the top of them, for all of this information, it's being driven by, as I understand it from a right-wing podcaster that I specifically asked about this, it's being driven by MyPillow CEO Mike Lindell, who's been doing these so-called election integrity summits around the country, encouraging people who are still denying the results of the 2020 election to do exactly this, to flood boards of elections with information requests. And the question is, of course, what are they hoping to find? I mean, when I talked to a University of Florida professor who is an expert in election systems, he said, this is potentially a way to gum up the system using a loophole in public records law. And the information they get, Mike Lindell himself has been shown to put it in formats that don't make any sense and make it look like it says something that it doesn't. And so
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think there's a real concern about that.
Yeah, and the thing is too, Ohio's public records laws are they're some of the best in the country. And therefore, for agencies or jurisdictions like a board of election, they want to do what's right by the public records law, yet it's colliding now with their ability to conduct what their main job is, which is to run election at the county level. So on one hand, it's almost, as you said, it's an effort almost to gum the system up to, in a way, make the 2022 election look like, in some people's minds, it's not going to be legitimate because of just the sheer volume of things that are now confronting boards of election, who are all hardworking people. That's the thing. It's not as if they're just sitting around and like the day before the election, they decide, yeah, I suppose we should take the machines out to the precincts. I mean, the planning for that is astounding if you watch them do it.
There's a very specific schedule of things that they have to do on certain times. And again, these are people in the community. I mean, boards of elections and poll workers come from your community. And so it's important to remember that these are people in your sphere, so to speak. They're not outsiders. They're not operatives. They're people who work in the community.
Yeah, they're your neighbors. They're your neighbors and your friends. And I think that's what people have to remember, that they don't go in there with some sort of closet agenda to do something to the election. They're there just to try to make the process work so that you can go in and vote efficiently, effectively, and have confidence in the outcome. And I think that's what's can get, as you said, getting distorted by all of these other things. When you were talking with the candidates, and I said you've talked with treasurers and auditors so far, the candidates for those offices, those five statewide offices all sit on the redistricting commission. I noticed you've been asking the current incumbents who are on that committee, which of course had some ups and downs in terms of getting maps, which still aren't necessarily the maps the Ohio Supreme Court likes. Their response to that I thought was kind of interesting, the people you've talked to so far, about how that process works and how it did or didn't work in their mind.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at, and that's another reason why these executive offices are so important, on that 7-member redistricting commission, which will have to start the process of drawing maps, because the maps that we're using in November have been ruled unconstitutionally gerrymandered, so they're not legal maps. So this panel will have to draw new maps starting probably next year.
Right.
3 of the members on that panel are these executive statewide office holders: the governor, secretary of state, and auditor.
Right.
And so when I spoke to the auditor candidate, and also I've at this point spoken to Secretary of State Frank LaRose, not his Democratic opponent Chelsea Clark yet, but asking them and asking not only Auditor Keith Faber, but also his Republican challenger Taylor Sappington about the roles that they would have to play on this. And if indeed Republicans do win those seats, Republicans will continue to dominate the Ohio Redistricting Commission. And therefore, the maps, we may be right back into this cycle of maps submitted, they're rejected by the Ohio Supreme Court, they have to go back and redraw. Of course, the other kind of wild card here is what's going to happen with the 3 seats on the Ohio Supreme Court. Right. And as I do the math, Democrats have to win 2 of the 2 associate justices seats, not the Chief Justice, but the 2 associate justice seats they have to dominate the court and to have a Democratic majority on the court. I don't know whether that's going to happen. Certainly those races are getting a lot more attention than they've gotten in previous years. But if the court is dominated by Republicans and the Ohio Redistricting Commission is dominated by Republicans, we could see maps that activists who said they wanted fair districts will be very unhappy with. And their options were very limited.
Yeah, and as we know, there was a Republican, the one who is now age limited out by the way the laws are in Ohio regarding judges, was a Republican who was the swing vote that said, no, your maps are not constitutional. I guess, as you said, one of the possibilities here would be that if the Republicans gained control, well, they had theoretically had control of the Supreme Court anyway, but the idea is to get a Republican justice in there who will vote more like a Republican, I guess, even though the state Supreme Court is supposed to be nonpartisan. But in this case...
Well, and this year it's not. This year it's not, because this year you actually will see the party affiliation of the candidate for Supreme Court for the very first time.
Right.
They were required to run in partisan primaries, but it used to be on the November ballot, there would not be a partisan designation. Now there is.
Yeah.
And one thing I think is interesting, there's a really weird twist here in that you have 2 justices who are both running for Chief Justice. Jennifer Brunner, the Democrat, Sharon Kennedy, the Republican. Whoever wins the governor's office gets to appoint that person's replacement. So let's say Mike DeWine wins, as polls suggest that he's going to, then he would potentially get to appoint another Republican justice to the Ohio Supreme Court. So if Jennifer Brunner wins, another Republican joins the court. So it's an interesting little twist here. Of course, if Democrats win, all things are different here. So that's why I said winning those 2 associate justices seats,
so it would be
Marilyn Zayas and Terry Jamison running against Pat Fisher and Pat DeWine, that potentially has a better opportunity for Democrats than winning the Chief Justice opportunity.
Yeah, and when I said nonpartisan, I was basically trying to imply that we hope that the court doesn't rule in partisan ways, but in this case, that's almost what there's a hope for, maybe on one particular party's side, that they will get rid of that one justice that kept voting those maps down. So we'll see. We'll take a break real quick, come back. Our guest is Karen Kasler, the host of the State of Ohio here on The Journal. You're with us here on The Journal, and our guest is Karen Kasler, the host of the State of Ohio. You can watch her program every Sunday at 12 noon here on WBGU-PBS. Karen, as you said, you've been interviewing, having conversations with the candidates for statewide office, more of them to come. Of the ones you've done so far, is there any one response that maybe stands out as unique or stands out above the normal responses you get, which tend to be talking points?
Well, I think my interview with Keith Faber, the auditor, was interesting because, first of all, he kind of made some news in saying that the audit for the state teachers' retirement system that he announced a year ago is going to be coming out later this year. And he says that he has concerns about what he's seeing already. So I think that's interesting because we usually don't get a hint of something being a problem. And 157,000 retired teachers and survivors in Ohio are very concerned about some things that they feel is going on in that pension system. But he also talked about redistricting in particular. He was the only Republican to break with the other Republicans on that board and vote with the Democrats on a couple of different maps. Now, they voted together for entirely different reasons, but it allows Faber the opportunity to say, hey, I broke away from my party. I was trying to be bipartisan, and I really hope that we can come together on this. But like I said, the reasons for his joining with the Democrats were not the same reasons that they voted against the maps. And what it really comes down to is this process is going to continue to go on for months, if not years. And this is something that I think a lot of voters had thought was settled back in 2015 and 2018 with those constitutional amendments that said partisan gerrymandering won't happen in Ohio. Well, it is happening in Ohio.
Yeah, and I guess if you think about it, putting elected officials on the redistricting committee who are by definition partisan politicians, and then to think, oh, in this case they won't be partisan. It is what it is, but it looked good on paper anyway, I guess, at that point. One of the things that's come up in the course of your doing what you do, which is moderate debates and things like that, I know that obviously there's now a concern, or there's an issue that the Republicans weren't necessarily, in their opinion, weren't thrilled with the fact that you were asking to fact check them during the debates that you moderated earlier in the year. So talk a little about where that stands with their participation in state debates, because there's some, they are basically kind of, I understand, are saying, we're not going to do it. Is that where it sits right now?
Well, the Ohio Debate Commission has set up debates in Akron next month with the candidates for governor and U.S. Senate, and also a forum for Supreme Court candidates where they wouldn't be able to debate each other, but it would be more, because the rules are different for obviously people running for judicial offices.
Right.
And they've gotten acceptances from the Democrats in all of these offices, but none of the Republicans have said definitively that they will join. Mike DeWine has been signaling that he won't, because he says he's making himself available to reporters. He's going to do editorial boards, things like that. But it's J.D. Vance, I think, that has some real questions. Over the weekend, this past weekend, there was a story in the Lima News that specifically talked about how Republican Party Chair Bob Paduchik said he had heard concerns from people after the debate that I moderated for the Ohio Debate Commission in March for the Republican candidates for U.S. Senate. We had all 7 candidates on stage for 90 minutes. We had asked audience members to submit questions to a portal that was set up by the Debate Commission, and I took my questions to the candidates from those questions. Overwhelmingly, the number one question people wanted an answer to was the candidates' views on the 2020 election we just talked about. And I specifically phrased the question as, given that there have been no court cases, no audits that have shown anything other than Joe Biden won the 2020 election, what do you say about that? How do you continue to go on saying that the election was stolen from Donald Trump? And I fact-checked the candidates when they came up with answers that were
not
had
true.
Been fact-checked by others and were shown to be untrue.
Inaccurate, untrue, not based on any evidence. Right.
Exactly. And apparently Bob Paduchik, the chair of the Ohio Republican Party, said that our candidates complained to him that was a disservice to Republican primary voters who were legitimately trying to understand the issues and candidates. I'm quoting now from the article. The fact-checking that was done came across as an attempt to embarrass the candidates on stage, as well as discredit the millions of Ohioans who still believe there are unanswered questions about the 2020 election. And that's what he says. I stand by fact-checking candidates because I think it's important. And when you have candidates saying things that have been proven untrue by other independent fact checkers, it's important to note that and
to point that out, and not just let them perpetuate the misconception or the misappropriation of the accurate what actually happened, I guess. And so they're holding that in essence kind of against you a little bit for basically holding their feet to the fire and saying, no, what you just said isn't true. What do you say to that? And I guess I guess no politician likes to have their feet held to the fire, I guess. And you did that in a very
important.
It's important, and it should be what people expect to have happen, not to then use that as a reason to say, oh well, then we're not going to participate because you're going to make us follow some rules, and we don't want to do that. We don't want to be held accountable for what we say, I guess, and that's unfortunate.
Candidates always have to agree when they do debates. They always have to agree to a set of rules, and I think it's kind of amazing that a candidate would accept going on stage and not be accepting that a journalist is going to note that what the candidate said is untrue. I mean, I'm a journalist. This is my job.
Absolutely. So no, nothing to apologize at all for. They're not even, it shouldn't even be a point of contention at all. So yeah, okay, good. Well, we're gonna out of time right here, but appreciate you again coming on, and we'll talk again sometime around the election, if not before, at least afterwards, to see what all of this looks like in Ohio after November 8th. So Karen Kasler, thank you for being here today again. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Great. And you can check us out at WBGU.org. And of course, you can watch us every Thursday night at 8 o'clock on WBGU-PBS. We see you again next time. Good night and good luck.